This is Brad Bannon. I'm hosting the Leslie Marshall Show tonight. I apologize. We had some technical problems at the top of the hour, but we're back now. Our guest in the first hour is Sam Bennett. She's been on the show with me before, president of the Women's Campaign Forum. And Sam will discuss attempts by religious conservatives and the radical right to limit women's freedom of choice. And before we get to Sam, of course, we have my nightly rant. Last week, Nancy Pelosi correctly identified the problem with the GOP when she slammed congressional Republicans for not introducing any bill to create new jobs. The GOP has found the time and energy, however, to conduct a witch hunt of Muslim Americans and introduce legislation to limit freedom of choice for women, and yesterday to ratify a decision the founders made over 2 centuries ago that our national motto should be, "In God We Trust." I thought we had settled that already. Maybe I'm missing something, but the exit polls from the midterm elections last year show that voter concern about the economy drowned out interest in any social issue. While movement on cultural issues should please right-wing Republican activists, only progress on creating jobs will make Americans happy. As promised, our guest in this first hour is Sam Bennett, Executive Director of the Women's Campaign Forum. Sam, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing very well, and it's a pleasure to be back on.
Let me ask you before I ask you a question. By the way, if you want to call and talk to Sam yourself, you can give us a call at 888-6-LESLIE. Okay, let's start with this, Sam. My first question is, maybe it was just me and I missed something. It wouldn't be the first time. Didn't Republicans promise to focus pretty exclusively on jobs during the campaign last year?
Well, I mean, the results of the midterm elections clearly showed that folks were just mad as heck, and they weren't going to take it anymore, and they were mad about the economy. So they just went out and they voted for change, an ironic sort of echo or ripple or repeat of the change that they ushered in when they elected Obama, who would not have been elected unless a lot of Republicans had voted for him. And they did. So now we have Democrats and Republicans voting for Republicans this past time. Why? Well, because they want change. And they blamed the Democrats for the state of the economy, swept a bunch of these folks in, and you hit the nail on the head, sir. They haven't focused on jobs for 1 nanosecond. What are they focusing on? They're focusing on the agenda of a tiny percentage of the Republican Party. Some polls show it as slim as 6%. This sort of very active, or in your language, Brad, the radical right. And what are those folks focused on? Taking away individuals' ability to make their own important life decisions. They want those important life decisions, Brad, to be made by the government. So I got to tell you, it's a really frightening environment, but one that seems to be waking folks up from complacency. So it'll be interesting. Maybe they've already overplayed their hand, and maybe there's going to be a lot more good that comes out of this in the long run. But it sure is a real troubling time, Brad.
Yeah, I'd say so. Well, why don't you, Sam, give our listeners some background on what's going on now on the issue of a woman's freedom to choose. And it seems to me, just from following the news, there have been very active efforts by Republicans to limit women's freedom of choice at both the national level and in different states. So let's start at the national level. What are the congressional Republicans trying to do here to limit the freedom of choice for women?
Well, I think starting at the national level and then taking a look at what's going on at state level is absolutely the right approach, because it's really breathtaking, Brad, the consistency of what's going on both those levels. If we start with the federal, you have something called H.R. 3, right? And so H.R. 3 means it's a third piece of legislation introduced for the new Congress. And what are they focusing on? Well, they're focusing on basically now the current iteration of that legislation is that women, even if they're willing to pay out of their own pocket, aren't able to buy the full course of reproductive choices and options, even if they want to pay for it themselves. That's how restrictive this is. And in its original iteration, it did things like say, well, you know, a rape doesn't count as a rape unless it's forcible, i.e. at gunpoint or knife point, which is unconscionable, indefensible. In truth be known, 70% of rapes involve no weapon, but yet this piece of legislation, the third piece of legislation that was introduced by the new Congress, not a jobs bill, right, but this.
Yeah, I remember when that happened, and I remember thinking to myself at the time they were going to redefine rape so it was only forcible rape. My first inclination was, well, isn't rape by definition forcible?
Thank you. Yes, it's not an act of sexual passion. It's an act of violence. All rape is forcible rape, but they were seeking to redefine it as only that which involved a weapon. And the idea being that, unless a weapon was involved, I guess the woman could have prevented it. So it's really, really heinous, indefensible, shameful piece of legislation.
Okay, Sam, we're going to go to break now, and we'll continue this discussion with more of the Leslie Marshall Show after these messages.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of truth. The Leslie Marshall Show, 888-6-LESLIE. Want to listen to Leslie with zero commercials? Become a podcast subscriber today. Go to lesliemarshallshow.com/members.
Okay, this is Brad Bannon back with more of the Leslie Marshall Show. Our guest in this hour is Sam Bennett, who's the president of the Women's Campaign Forum. We've been talking about Republican attempts to limit freedom of choice for women. If you want to join in the conversation, give us a call at 888-6-LESLIE. Sam, the House of Representatives has just passed a budget which, among other things, takes away funding, federal funding for Planned Parenthood clinics. Is that correct?
No, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yes, in the House, and now it's in the Senate. That's correct.
Okay. And, you know, it seems to me, from what I know about Planned Parenthood, they do a lot of valuable work, family planning, contraceptives, and it seems to me if you shut down Planned Parenthood clinics, you're just going to get more women who want to have abortions. So isn't this kind of counterproductive for the religious right?
Yeah, you couldn't be more on point with that, Brad. And really, this whole conundrum underlines the importance of if we had more women in elected office, Brad, we wouldn't be, particularly women that support reproductive choices and options, which is, what we're all about, right? We've been doing it for 36 years. We're the oldest that have been doing this work all this time. And, Brad, as you know, we support both Republican and Democratic women. And as Stupak Pitts pointed out, you can't protect reproductive choices and options, which 81% of Americans agree with, unless you do it on both sides of the aisle. And this current bill that you're talking about, H.R. 3, some folks are calling it sort of the Uber Stupak Pitts, right? It's Stupak on steroids.
And Stupak was a conservative Democrat who opposed abortion
really,
rights.
really, really heinous. So, yes, it's in the Senate right now, and hopefully with the Democrats still controlling the Senate, it won't go any further.
Now, I did read, I think, I'm doing this broadcast out of Washington, and I read in the paper, I think Washington Post today, or Cellmates, that two female Republican senators were leading the fight in the Senate to prevent the cutoff of Planned Parenthood. I guess Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, and was it Olympia Snowe from Maine?
Yeah, are you referring to Senator Collins and Snowe?
Yes.
There are women that our organization has been supporting since we were founded. In fact, Olympia Snowe got her first check when she ran for office from us. We have a photocopy of that check in our office. But yes, and in fact, Senator Snowe was, one of the deciding votes on the passage of the health care bill. And that's a really great example of how it's so important that you have these moderate Republican women in addition to Democrats to support these important agendas for all Americans.
Yeah, well, let's talk now about the state level. I've read about some, how I can only describe as bizarro attempts by state legislators to limit women's freedom of choice. One I read about for the first time today is in Texas, where the state legislature is working on a bill that would allow abortions only in cases where the life of the mother is in danger and not allow exceptions for rape and incest. Is that true?
Yes, it is. And Rick Perry, I'm originally from Matagorda Bay, Texas, right, way back when. And, Governor Perry, here's another example. He put that original bill, H.R. 15, on emergency status, so it was one of the first pieces of legislation that they were going to pass in Texas, when really what they should have been focusing on is jobs or his $27 billion deficit in the Texas budget. Instead, he's focusing on things like this. And the original bill requires women, and it passed, any woman for any circumstance who's been raped, incest, the fetus is not viable outside the womb, to look at requires the doctor to show the woman a sonogram, requires the doctor to have the woman listen to a fetal heartbeat. I mean, this is politicians, Brad, dictating how doctors do their jobs. And what is healthy about that? What is effective about that? What is reasonable about that? Nothing. And the current iteration, the current bill they've got going on in Texas, is just an out-and-out abortion ban. As you said, even if one of my best friends was a Catholic and she became pregnant with her fourth child, the doctor told her the fetus was not viable outside the womb. In fact, if she had carried it, it would have put her own life in danger. So now Anne Marie in Texas, would not have been able to terminate that pregnancy, right, under those circumstances. So it's really just a terrible, terrible, terrible environment. And the thing that disturbs me the most, Brad, and I think this would resonate for you, is I think most of this legislation, Brad, is not being put forward because someone's got an axe to grind with women. Particularly, I think half of this is going on. Rick Perry wants to be the next, he wants to be a vice presidential candidate in 2012.
So you're saying...
He wants to show just how far right he'll go to win the support of that very small percentage of the Republican Party that seems to be pulling not only the Republican Party, the whole nation by their nose. So that's what I find most disturbing. This is not values-based legislation. It is politically motivated with governors and state legislators seeking to earn points in their own party. It's disgusting.
So, and also, in addition to, you said how right they can go, I would say how low they can go.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you, Brad, on that one. It's awful.
Let's try Kansas. I understand that the Kansas legislature is considering legislation that would eliminate the nonprofit status for hospitals and clinics that perform abortions.
Sure, it's just more harassing behavior, right? So you're going to make a hospital board of trustees go, we can't provide this service anymore, this essential life-saving service, because we'll lose our nonprofit status. You know, people have got to start remembering, Brad, that number one, that Roe versus Wade was passed to save women's lives. Before Roe versus Wade was passed, women were dying like flies because they had no legal, safe way to terminate pregnancies. Well, guess what? They did it anyway, and they died.
Yeah, backroom abortions.
They died in droves. And so that's why Roe versus Wade was passed. And folks have got to start remembering that, Brad. And what's happening in Kansas is just basically the sort of persecuting behavior that's been going on, and it's going on right here in my hometown of Allentown, Pennsylvania, quite frankly, at a clinic we have here, to make it too difficult for them to operate, and they close down. But the problem is when you close these clinics down, it isn't that women are going to stop needing this essential service. They're going to take matters into their own hands, and they're going to start dying again. And folks have got to remember that. And again, I can't stress enough, Brad, when the health care bill, when that was trying to be passed, there was a Republican, far-right Republican, that stood up and said, well, pregnancy shouldn't be covered by this health care bill because pregnancy is a pre-existing condition.
Oh, God.
And God bless her, Senator Debbie Stabenow stood up and said to him on the floor, your mother would be very ashamed to hear you say that, sir.
Yikes.
Women must be part of our governing and legislating and lawmaking. They're the only ones that can bring some sanity back to this process. And quite frankly, again, we need Republican women and Democratic women to help move this agenda forward because this is just insane. And we need women at all levels of office. And, we need women in Kansas fighting stuff like this. We need women in Texas fighting stuff like this. We need women in Georgia fighting that piece of state legislation. What was that one, Brad? That was that any woman who couldn't prove that her miscarriage was natural, she'd be facing felony charges.
Wow.
Felony charges. And the worst one of all of them was South Dakota, where they tried to pass a bill that would make it legal to kill in cold blood any doctor or nurse that assisted or provided abortion.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Yeah, holy cow.
So, we need women, and this is my little drum beat, Brad, but I'll keep beating my drum.
Okay, go ahead. That's why you're on.
We need women at all levels of office, and and the problem in our country is women think of running for office, Brad, 50% less than men do. And then of that smaller pool, only 30% of those women actually run. And of that pool, only 30% run for higher office. So it's really, really essential that you're listening, progressive, wonderful listening audience for the Leslie Marshall Show and your show, Brad, nominate a woman they know who's just a fabulous PTA leader, strong voice in the community. Nominate her to run for office. Personally encourage her. Put some money in her hand. Write her a check because that's what this country needs on both sides of the aisle.
Tell us a little bit about the Women's Campaign Forum and how you try to encourage the women to run for office.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, Brad. Again, we're the oldest organization that's been doing this work, and where we focus, Brad, is on the very, very early stages of getting more women to think of running, and when they do make that decision to run, we're their first endorsement, their first check. There is not a woman on the Hill, including Susan Collins, Olympia Snow, Geraldine Ferraro just called me the other day on the phone, and she said, Sam, I just want to call and tell you that there's nothing I wouldn't do for Women's Campaign Fund because you were my first check when no one else would believe in me back in 1978 when I first ran for Congress. And that story is repeated over and over and over on the Hill where we do business in D.C. So there's a program we have, Brad, called She Should Run. And that program, people can go right online, Brad, sheshouldrun.org, nominate a woman that you know, because when you ask a woman to run, if she's asked by someone that she knows or respects, then she'll run. See, when men wake up in the morning, they look in the mirror and they go, see a senator, right?
Yep.
Well, you walk up to any woman and you ask her, hey, she might have a master's in education, Brad. You'll ask her to run for school board, and she'll say, I'm not qualified.
Oh, God.
So it's a huge hurdle in getting more women to run for office. So any folks out there that know of a talented woman, please go on to sheshouldrun.org. And then we tell these women, we help them, we nurture them, and then we guide them to all the other organizations, wonderful organizations that are out there that can help them and support them. But we're that early stage endorser. And you know, Brad, very well our work with Name It, Change It, going after and defending women against media misogyny when they become candidates and media sexism. And you were a great supporter of that Name It, Change It campaign in the midterms, and we'll be starting that back up again in the fall. And then finally, we've got the early endorsement and financial support that we provide to women candidates to help them get started and have successful campaigns. We've been doing it for 36 years.
If our listeners want to get more information about the Women's Campaign Forum, I assume you have a website or something.
It's real easy. It's WCFonline.org, WCF, Women Campaign Frank, Women's Campaign Fund, online.org. And Brad, I really enjoy being on your show, and I'll announce this here. We're going back to our original name, Women's Campaign Fund. So we're no longer Women's Campaign Forum anymore.
Okay.
We're Women's Campaign Fund, and you heard it first on the Brad Bannon Show.
Hey, there you go. Actually, it's the Leslie Marshall Show with Brad Bannon.
Oh, Leslie Marshall Show. But.
In case Leslie's listening, which I assume she is. Let me ask you one more question. Do you think we have elections next year. Do you think there's going to be a backlash against Republicans for these crazy things they're trying to do?
And you know, Brad, I apologize. I'm driving from D.C. to Pennsylvania right now, and I didn't quite hear that all of your question. Are you asking if you think a backlash is going to be happening against the Republicans based on all this nonsense?
Yes.
Who knows, right? The electorate, again, they're concerned about their pocketbook, but they certainly are overplaying their hand. I mean, no better example probably than what's been going on in Wisconsin with the rather heavy-handed elimination of collective bargaining in Wisconsin, and which has completely woken up the labor movement, probably to good long-term effect. And it has caused a lot of organizations on the Democratic side of the fence, quite frankly, to be able to raise a lot more money than they've been able to before this all started. So we'll have to see. But certainly the groundwork is being laid for that backslash to happen.
We can only hope, and I think you made a good point there, between women and labor. It seems to me that that right-wing religious conservatives and conservatives in general are trying to strip away a lot of the rights, whether it's collective bargaining or women's right to choose, that we've taken for granted for so long, and we can't take them for granted anymore.
Yeah, I think complacency has been the biggest enemy that we have faced, and on many fronts, and certainly they're handing the gift of waking folks up and not taking those things for granted anymore. The other thing that's pretty fascinating is that the Democratic Party, the progressive side of the fence, traditionally has a lot more women elected, right? Traditionally has a lot more women engaged in voting than the right, and clearly the union movement is one of the important bastions of moderate and democratic support.
Yes, it is. Sam, I want to thank you very much for joining us this evening, but unfortunately we have to go to break. Our guest in this hour was Sam Bennett, president of the Women's Campaign Fund. You heard it here, and we will be back with more of the Leslie Marshall Show after this message.